Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the webinar about transitioning into practice. Tonight, we will hear from Dr. Melissa Shepard. She is a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist, and we are going to get a little more insight on how to help you prepare for your journey as you transition from training to an attending physician. I'll let Dr. Shepard introduce herself in just a moment. I'm going to give a few people some time to log in. But in the meantime, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Peyton Jennings, and I am the Physician Engagement Coordinator for Practice Match. I work very closely with the residents and fellows that attend virtual career fairs. We do a lot with the virtual career fairs. We do free CV reviews, physician scholarships. We have these webinars that you're attending tonight. We have an immigration handbook and a physician career guidebook. So if you have any questions or want any additional information on any of the things that I just mentioned, feel free to message me and I can get those sent out to you. But in the meantime, I'll let Dr. Shepard introduce herself and go and start her presentation whenever she's ready.
Sounds good. Thank you. So as Peyton mentioned, I'm Melissa Shepard. I am an MD. I'm in private practice in actually my hometown in Southern Maryland now. I see patients in Maryland and North Carolina, which are the two states where I'm licensed. I was in another practice prior to starting my own private practice, and went to medical school at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, did my psychiatry residency at Johns Hopkins, and really enjoyed a lot of my training and felt that it was all great and like really prepped me well for entering the real world or whatever it may be as an attending. But I did feel that I was missing some of the pieces of like what that transition would actually look like. So I'm really excited that this is something that we're talking about, and this is something that hopefully we'll talk about more in, other residencies. There are two sort of areas that I want to focus on, and I would love to kind of keep this informal. So if you guys have any questions that come up during the webinar, feel free to let us know. Peyton will help me identify the questions and we can answer them as we go. But there are basically two big subjects that I think we need to talk about whenever we're talking about this transition from residency to attendinghood. The first one is sort of the practical side of things, which is probably what most of us get the most anxious about. So things like the financial side, thinking about logistics, moving, what life is going to look like when you're an attending versus when you're a resident. And that's sort of the stuff that's often in the forefront of our minds. But then there's this other really, really important piece that I think we don't talk about enough, and that I think is actually the undercurrent of a lot of our anxiety when we're getting ready to make this transition. And that's sort of the mental side, the emotional side, what is this transition going to look like, not on a logistic level, but on sort of a personal growth level. So I want to talk about a little bit of both of those things. And as you guys have questions, please feel free to ask in the chat. I'm going to be talking about these things assuming you guys are psychiatrists. Even if you aren't, hopefully it'll be applicable, but we'll kind of go from there because obviously that's what I have the most experience with. So let's talk about some of the more boring stuff, the more practical stuff first. This is the stuff like the business side of things. And this is going to really depend on what you actually decide to do when you go out on your own as an attending. And we're going to talk more about like making that decision and what that looks like in a moment. But this is the time to really rely on other people's areas of expertise, really reach out to other experts in other fields who can help you navigate this transition. So a good example is, whatever you decide to do once you begin to go out and be an attending. There will probably be some contracts involved. And so having an employment attorney, some sort of attorney looking over those contracts just to eyeball it, make sure that there's nothing out of the ordinary, nothing they're concerned about, that can be really helpful. But that's sort of the reaching out to experts part that I am referring to. So other things that you can do are like hiring an accountant to help you, especially if you're starting out in like a private practice. That can be incredibly helpful. A lawyer to help you, establish your business if that's something, you're going out and doing your own thing. Consider, everybody will tell you something different, but I think for the most part, people tend to agree that if you're getting board certified, doing that in the first year out of residency is usually pretty helpful. You will definitely be glad to have it over with. And I know a lot of times it's tempting to put it off because you're like, well, I'm making this huge transition. It's going to be really stressful, but like things always come up, throughout life. And I think many employers tend to be relatively sensitive to the fact that we do need to take boards, and hopefully will give you some grace while you're trying to prepare for those. So that's something sort of more on the business logistics side. The other really good resource that many of us don't think about is actually your malpractice insurance company. And no matter where you work, whether that's in your private practice or in a group practice in a hospital, you're going to have access to malpractice insurance, and they staff attorneys on these malpractice insurers that are usually very, very helpful. So I would say, like, when in doubt, call them. Even if you're like, I'm not sure this is a malpractice question, just give them a call. They're almost, I've had wonderful experiences with all of them, just sort of sorting out ethical questions, or I'm not sure what to do in this situation kind of questions. They're a great resource. So, and it's, if you're already paying for the malpractice insurance, this is something that's going to come with that. So it's something that feels free to use at the time, even though you are paying for the malpractice insurance. So you might as well use it. The other thing to think about as you're starting this transition, aside from sort of board certification stuff, you do want to start thinking about licensing pretty early. Just because as most people are familiar, it can take a while to get your license. And you have to get one for every state in the US. So start thinking about that early. If you know where you're going to be practicing, it's not going to hurt to get that process started. Many jobs will actually cover the cost, though, of your licensing. So even if you don't know exactly where you're going to be working, but you end up getting licensed in that state, keep the information, see if your job will cover the cost eventually. Same with DEA licensing. And that can be really helpful and just another nice piece to take care of during residency, so you feel like ready to go. And I think just, the other thing to keep in mind is that we don't learn a lot of this business stuff in med school and residency. I don't think I learned any business related stuff in med school or residency. So it feels very intimidating. And it feels really scary, especially if you end up deciding to go the private practice route, which is something that I did. I know, like, that learning curve seemed really, really steep. But, knowing that you've gotten through med school and residency, like, you are absolutely more than capable of learning to do some of this stuff. So take solace in that, and, reaching out to the experts that are there and able to help you. The other big source of potential support and help is mentorship. And mentorship is something that kind of happens naturally, I think, in med school and residency. Maybe you have to work a little bit harder for it in some situations than others. But mentorship is not something that has to stop with residency. You can continue to seek out mentors. You can keep mentors that you had in residency. just because you are not in residency anymore doesn't mean that you can't talk to those attendings who've been so helpful, throughout your training. I have called up many of my attendings since starting out as an attending and said, hey, how's it going? I know we haven't talked in a couple months, but I have this case and it reminded me of you and it's really stumped me. Can I run this stuff by you? And they have all been happy to hear from me. I've heard the same from my colleagues. They're always thrilled to hear from their former residents and incredibly helpful. And they just, will almost always like give you some really great advice, even though you're not working directly with them anymore. So the mentorship definitely doesn't stop with the end of residency. And if it makes you feel better, the other thing you can do is talk with a couple of your faculty members before you actually leave residency and say, hey, would it be cool if if I run into some trouble and need to run some stuff by you, could I reach out? They're going to say yes. They're going to be thrilled to talk with you, but it'll make you feel a little bit better just knowing you have that in your back pocket. Remember that you can have more than one mentor, and probably should, to be honest. It doesn't have to be a formal situation with everybody, but maybe you're joining a group practice and you have a therapist that you work with who you think is excellent in this particular form of therapy. So you decide to have them as a mentor to run some of your cases by. Maybe you know a neighbor who is a physician who seems like they have a really great work-life balance. And so you ask them questions when you see them out, getting in their car in the morning before they head off to work. That's a great resource, a great mentor for you. So looking at the different areas where you want to be successful and the areas where you want to sort of be involved and shape your career, and trying to find people who seem like they're excelling in those areas, identifying them, like I said, maybe just informally in your own head as like, this is somebody that I feel like is doing a good job. I want to be more like them. So let me take opportunities to like pick their brain if at all possible. There are, in addition to that sort of informal structure, there are absolutely opportunities for more formal supervision in psychiatry. And it's actually not uncommon that people do formal supervision as new psychiatrists. So typically what that looks like is reaching out to a psychiatrist in your community. Maybe it's somebody that you formed a connection with when you were in residency, and asking them to formally mentor you, maybe an hour each week or every other week, where you really sit down and go over cases with that person. Can be tremendously helpful. Usually that's something where you would pay the supervising physician for their time. Typically they ask for whatever their normal hourly rate is for patients. But it can be really helpful to like know that you have that chunk of time set aside if you have difficult cases, if you're struggling with something, that you have someone who has some expertise and can run it by them. The other thing to consider is potentially joining your local, state, or our national, like the APA organization, because those often have a lot of resources for early career psychiatrists, and they have some really good email listservs that can be very helpful. The Maryland Psychiatric Society, for example, has one where people often ask questions, get advice. The other sort of seemingly unlikely source is actually Facebook, but very physician psychiatry focused networks on Facebook that are super helpful. I've asked sort of logistic questions on there before. I see people ask about, I have this patient who's done X, Y, and Z, what do you guys think? Should I be thinking of anything else? Can be really helpful. So Psychiatry Network, I think, is one of the bigger groups, but there are many that can be very helpful. And don't be afraid to ask some of those questions. We all know what it's like, once you become an attending, we know what it's like to be an early career psychiatrist. So no one's going to fault you for, being a little bit more anxious once you go out on your own. You feel like you've almost lost this structure, and sort of this umbrella that's been keeping you safe. It's kind of like losing a safety blanket or something. Um, when you're out on your own, it can feel a little bit more scary. So it's kind of like that transition from med school to like your internship, where in med school, you maybe don't ask as many questions because you don't have quite as much responsibility. Maybe you're not as anxious about figuring out what this patient might need for their insomnia because you're not the one making the ultimate call. But then intern year, I don't know about you guys, but I remember putting in my first order for Benadryl for someone and checking like 8,000 times that I was giving them the right dose of Benadryl, even though this is something we've all taken before, right? You just kind of psych yourself out. And I feel like that happens also when you're moving from like residency to attending hood, because you feel like you don't have the same scaffolding and it can be really intimidating. And so remember, if you need to check your dose of Benadryl a couple extra times, or if you need to reach out and just talk through a case with somebody, that's okay. We've all been there. It can be hard starting out. So that's kind of more on the logistics, practical side. Are there any questions about that side of things? Because I'm going to talk a little bit more about the sort of emotional side of transitioning from residency to attending hood. But any questions about the logistics yet? And Peyton, would I be able to see them if there are questions that pop up?
Yes. So if you
Okay,
guys have any questions, you can either put those in the chat box or the Q&A, and those will pop up at the bottom of your screen.
awesome. Okay, so I don't see any yet, so I'll keep an eye out though. So kind of to transition to more of like the mental, emotional side. I think this is the real, like, we spend so much time worrying about the logistics of things, but the actual emotional toll of the transition is something that we really don't talk about enough. And I remember being really freaked out like last year of residency, trying to figure out what I wanted to do for like my big girl job and not knowing what I was going to do. And it seemed like this was something that I should have known by then. It seemed like this was something we really didn't talk about a ton, that we should just be able to figure it out. I shouldn't be particularly anxious about it, but it felt really scary. And so, like, in talking about that, I realized more and more that other people were really anxious about the transition too. And it is a really scary.
Melissa, I think your screen's frozen. Okay, for all the attendees tonight, can you guys put in the chat box if the screen was frozen for you guys on Melissa's side, and let me know. Okay, so I'm seeing in the Q&A box, other people, it was present for them as well. So, oh, did it join in again? Are you there?
I am so sorry.
No, it's okay. It
Was
froze
that,
up and I was just
yeah,
making sure.
was that just me that got booted?
It was, yeah. To my knowledge, I think we were all here. I was trying to ask in the chat.
Yeah, I still see attendees in there. So, okay. I'm sorry. I don't know where. What's that?
Continue whenever you're ready.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know what's going on with my connection, but hopefully it holds out the rest of the time. So I think what you probably heard last was the stress of like, we know that we have to make this jump from resident to attending, but it's not as like neatly laid out for us as things have been up to this point. So, you decide you want to become a physician, you go to college, you do your prerequisites, you have to take your MCAT, you're going to be going to med school. You have to make choices as far as like which med school, which residency, whatever. But you kind of know the path that you're going to take, and you just sort of keep marching along that path. Once you get to the end of residency, it's like the doors kind of open up and you really are able to choose what it's like the ultimate choose your own adventure. And that's cool. That's great. Like that's part of the beauty of it. But also that can be really intimidating and really overwhelming, especially when we've had so many years of like, do X to get to Y to get to Z. So that's why I think a lot of the stress comes in. And the way I try to teach people about, how to navigate that transition is pretty stepwise. So when you're in psychiatry, you're thinking about becoming, what your life as an attending is going to look like. Sit down and really think about what some of your values are. I know many of us have some expertise in like acceptance and commitment therapy or DBT. And in those forms of therapy, as in with some others, we talk about what our values are with patients. And that's something we can actually do for ourselves. So like, is one of your values getting your debt paid down as quickly as possible? Is it having good work-life balance? Is it seeing complicated cases? Is it learning a lot from other people in like an academic setting? So think about where your values are. And if you can, sit down and sort of rank them loosely, but like thinking about what is going to be more important to you when you're looking for a job. You might not find something that ticks all of your boxes, but if your work-life balance is like by far and away the most important thing, and you decide to take a job that has a tremendous amount of call because the pay is really good, you may not be as happy as you could be in that position because you're not able to like truly meet some of your values where they are. Think about like, even if you don't actually pursue a fellowship, think about establishing an area of expertise within psychiatry. So it doesn't have to be super formal. It can be as simple as like identifying something that you are particularly good at or interested in. And this is really most important if you decide to go into private practice, because you want to be kind of known for something. Doesn't mean you can't see depression if you are an expert in anxiety or ADHD, but it means that you're going to really make people excited about the idea of seeing you for your expertise in one specific area. And that can be really helpful in establishing like a patient base. So for me, for example, I am still on faculty at Hopkins where I teach once a week. It's a anxiety and OCD clinic. We teach the residents there. It's a really fun clinic for me. And so it's something I really enjoy, but it also then enables me to say like, hey, I have this experience that enables me to be really good at treating anxiety and OCD. This is something this is an area of expertise of mine. You don't even have to be on faculty somewhere though to say that. Just, if you have a special interest in ADHD, for example, you're probably going to be better at treating that than the average psychiatrist just because you are so interested in it. So picking an area of expertise, kind of honing in on that, and that can be a good way to establish like a client or patient base. So we're talking about, figuring out your values, thinking about areas of expertise, but to even back up further, when you are thinking about what your job might look like, the first thing to consider that a lot of us kind of skip over is whether you even want to be working in a clinical setting. I think most of us automatically assume like after residency, we're going to be seeing patients in some capacity, but there are a tremendous number of jobs in medicine that actually don't involve patient care. And that's something that, many people will say like, I'm burned out. I want to take a little bit of time off of patient care. I want to try and do some other stuff. Some people have some jobs on the side, like I do some writing, I do some stuff on social media, and that enables me to see a little bit fewer patients during the week so that I can kind of, do some of these other non-clinical things that also interest me. So that's something to think about. And I think one of the big questions in psychiatry is always outpatient versus inpatient medicine. So figuring out whether you want to see patients in like a clinic setting versus seeing them in the hospital. Part of that might be comfort level. I know that like everybody's training is very different between different psychiatry programs. You may feel more comfortable with patients who are in the hospital. Somebody else may feel more comfortable with patients who are not in the hospital. And there are unique areas to think about for each of those. I'm happy to like talk a little bit more about that if you guys are interested in it. But thinking, okay, do I want clinical or non-clinical work? Do I want inpatient or outpatient work? The other thing to think about is, do you want to have one job as your full-time job, or do you want to have some part-time work that you do as well? And it could be things like the kind of side hustles I was talking about with like writing and, non-clinical work. The other thing that's really common in psychiatry is when people are first starting up a private practice, they'll oftentimes join either a group or they will join like what's it called, like a student health organization and see patients like in the student health clinic. So that can be a really helpful way to make sure that you're keeping up with some income. You might be able to keep some health insurance that way while you're also building up your panel of private practice patients. You can think about whether you want to do something permanently versus start out with like some locum tenens. There can be pluses and minuses to each of that. And again, we can talk about that too. But something to think about with all of this, when we're talking about values, thinking about like how much control do you want over your day-to-day life? How much flexibility is going to be important to you? How much variety do you need? Do you want to work at all on the business end of things? Like for someone who's in their private practice, they're likely going to be doing a lot more of, the day-to-day running their payroll or, maybe even the nitty-gritty like prior authorizations versus somebody in a group practice who may be doing less of that. All of that stuff is important when you're thinking about what setting you want to be practicing in. So just sort of, I guess, one other expectation that I think we often have when we're making this transition from resident to attending is thinking that we have to make the perfect choice. Like there's one right choice and we have to find it. And that's something I want to like help you guys kind of get away from thinking, because I think that really puts a ton of unnecessary stress on you. And it also just isn't right. So the vast majority of people, their first job is not going to be their forever job. That's actually really, really rare. Um, Most psychiatrists kind of starting out are going to end up making a shift to another job within like the first year or so. And I feel like we've been taught throughout our training to be so self um so other focused, and so, put our own self sort of on the back burner, that we dedicate like ourselves to a certain academic institution or to just our careers in general. But you're probably not going to stay in the first job you choose, just statistically speaking, and that is okay. The point is that you choose a job, you start learning, you figure out more and more what you like. It's so hard to tell what psychiatry looks like outside of academic medicine, because that's really most of all we've known during our training. Um, and oh, I saw a question come through. Hold on, let me just look at this. So this question was, I value work-life balance and autonomy, so private practice appeals to me, but is also intimidating. I felt the same way. Did you start a private practice right after training, or do you recommend joining a group initially? I chose to join a group initially, and honestly, part of the reason that I chose that was because I never thought I would be able to like figure out the whole private practice deal. It was like honestly the last thing I saw myself doing. But I started with my group practice, was actually primarily seeing patients with dementia. And then when COVID hit, we really like things essentially like ground to a halt, because patients, were all in facilities, and like we couldn't get in to see them. They didn't, weren't able to see us. The telehealth thing wasn't going so well with that population. So for primarily for like financial reasons, like practical reasons, I was like, okay, I gotta do something. So I decided to start the private practice. And it was helpful to start that while I was still at that other job, because like I said, it gives you time to like figure things out as you go. So if you can have something else lined up at least part-time, I think that can be super helpful. But I was in the group practice for, I guess, 2 years maybe before I started private practice. I don't think you necessarily need to be in a group initially. Just for financial stability, I would say like having something else on the side. And then the other part of the question was, are there any resources for practical things like which EMR to choose, how to get on insurance panels, et cetera, if you'd like to start on your own? I have a couple of, so actually let me skip to the resources section here. Okay. So the New England Journal of Medicine Career Center has a lot of good resources. That's going to be like physicians in general, not psychiatry specific. But the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, has a guide on practice management basics and transition to practice and early career resources, sort of as an umbrella over that. I thought that was a very helpful resource. But to be honest with you, the most helpful resource was mentors. So if you have any like residents who graduated from your program before you and went out into private practice, I reached out to a couple of them and was like, hey, I'm lost. Like, I don't know what to do. Where do I start? They were incredibly helpful, and I would definitely like recommend reaching out to people if at all possible. Because everybody's like really excited to help you get started too. So it's fun to like connect with them again. The other thing to mention is with private practice, it does seem really intimidating, but this is an amazing time to start a private practice, because you can essentially do a telehealth, you still can do a telehealth only practice and the overhead is incredibly low. So you really need, I think I pay like $90 a month for my electronic medical record. Um, and you really need very little to get started. And it's, you just kind of pick up. And the thing about psychiatry is that, for better or worse, like we are very much so in demand right now. And I don't see that necessarily going away anytime soon. So once if you put out an advertisement or a profile on like Psychology Today, for example, which is where most psychiatrists will advertise their practice, you can expect to start getting several calls a day, in many areas, even if you aren't paneled with any insurance companies. So eventually, if you want to get on insurance panels, that's something that often does take time, but there are some ways to kind of do that. But starting with self-pay, people are often happy to pay self-pay and then get reimbursed. There's something called a super bill that you can complete. Your patient can, essentially what that means is your patient pays you for the visit before the visit starts, or, at the time of the visit. You fill out a super bill with the different codes that apply to that visit, and then you give that to the patient. They can submit that to their insurance company to potentially be reimbursed for out of network, whatever out of network coverage they have. So many patients are cool with that. And then, like, okay, I'll jump on an insurance panel if you happen to be credentialed with my insurance company later. The other thing that's kind of taken off during the kind of COVID telehealth era is companies that will help you get credentialed with insurance companies and will help streamline that payment slash billing process quite a bit. So I work with one called Headway, which has been really helpful. So essentially what I do is see the patient. Headway has gotten me credentialed with the different insurance companies in the area. I see the patient, put in my billing codes, and they, guarantee payment and pay me in bulk every 2 weeks for the patients I've seen. I've also heard of Alma, which is a similar service, and I'm sure that there are many others. So that's something to look into if you're feeling very intimidated, like I was, about the insurance panel situation. So yeah, hopefully that kind of helps answer some of those questions. It is really intimidating, but I promise if you got through med school and residency, you can absolutely figure it out. I never would have imagined I could have figured it out, but if I can do it, like anybody can do it. So yeah, I guess the only other thing to sort of mention is throughout like med school and residency, I think we've been taught to really put ourselves on the back burner, deprioritize ourselves. And it's exhausting. Like by the time you're at the end of residency, you're like, man, it's a slog. And I think that the first year out of residency can also be very intimidating and has the potential to be very burnout inducing. But this is the time where you guys start to actually, for the first time, have some autonomy and have some control a little bit over your life, right? And what you want your work-life balance to look like. And so this is the time to start prioritizing that wellness so that you don't burn out. It's no more like the, mandatory residency sponsored yoga retreat or whatever. It's like real life, actual work-life balance. And it's going to feel weird. It's going to feel weird to leave at 5 o'clock in the evening. It's going to feel weird to not work on the weekends. But if you can put some of those boundaries in place and remember that you're sort of in it for the long haul now, I think that can be tremendously helpful. And this is also the time to start thinking about like your financial wellness too. So, we're in a lot of debt. Many of us have not started saving for like retirement or for our kids or for, any of that stuff. And so sometimes it can be helpful to meet with an accountant or a financial advisor, even just for your personal financial health. So that's something to start thinking about. Your job may start to offer like some of those sort of benefits, which is something we've, maybe had access to before, but very, very limited. But right now there is such a need for psychiatrists, and there is such a shortage of psychiatrists that you really are truly in demand. And I think we're not used to being in that position during medical training. Like, we're used to being like, please somebody pick me, like pick me for med school, please pick me for residency. And this is the opposite situation. So I want you guys to feel empowered by that, and to remember to ask for what you're worth, and to start to practice setting some of those boundaries for your work-life balance, for your own mental health. And it'll feel weird at first, but you'll get there, and you'll be a better doctor for it. Any other questions at all? Or any other topics that you guys wanted to touch on? Well, if there's nothing else, I am, like I said, I do some stuff on social media. If you want, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. And I think like Practice Match, MD Links, and some of the other resources I mentioned are great for people who are early on in their career, starting out. There's a lot of great resources, and a lot of really cool people who, have made this early career transition and are doing well and want to help you do the same thing. So definitely reach out to them. You got this. It's not as scary as it seems. And you'll get there. But thank you guys for coming and for chatting.
If there is no other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up. If you guys think of a question later on, like Melissa said, feel free to reach out to either her or I can point you in the right direction. But I just want to say thank you all for your time this evening, and thank you, Melissa, for doing this webinar for all of us.
Sure thing. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I hope you guys all have a great night.
Good luck, guys. Bye.
Bye.